It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. We're going to be talking today about my thoughts on does science point to atheism. But before that, I just wanted to explain to you a little bit more about who I am and what I do. I'm just a scientist. I'm not a philosopher. This is a results slide for some of the work I do. I study how drugs are metabolized or changed in our body. I build computational models to predict that. So for example, you can see a whole bunch of drug molecules here, and then a few of them here on the bottom are actually toxic, and our software can actually predict which ones are toxic out of these versus not, and how that actually happens. So that's what I do. Now, I think there's two people in this room. Some people are thinking, wow, this is like totally boring and mundane. And then some of you are like, wow, this is amazing. And I want to know more. I'm kind of like the second one. Like, that's how a lot of science is. It's like mundane to everyone but us. And we spend all of our time just completely wrapped up in this. And I've just kind of found myself in science, and I love it. I really am a scientist. But I'm also a Christian, and so as I think about science, the thing that I devoted my entire life to, I do kind of wonder how that relates to my faith. And there's this idea that science implies atheism. And so I want to kind of put out one way someone might come to that thought. Richard Dawkins kind of makes this case. Other people do too. And show you kind of what I think about it. So the basic idea, and there's a lot of words up here. You can either read it or you can listen to me either way. But the basic idea is that the narrative is that, a long time ago, belief in God made sense because we didn't really understand nature. But now we do. Science actually explains everything in nature, so God is now obsolete. We don't really need him anymore to explain things. And so because, science is this amazing thing that we've all figured out and agree upon as a good way to understand things in the world, and it doesn't really see any evidence of God, that kind of means that God doesn't exist. And, that's an interesting thought. A lot of people really believe that. Maybe a lot of people here believe that too. And I can see how someone might think that, but ultimately I'm going to disagree. But before I get into my disagreements and I give a couple of objections to this line of reasoning, I want to talk about the big agreements. I want to agree that nothing in science proves, and I put quotes around that, that a knowable and good God exists. I think any human effort to prove God from nature is misguided and ultimately fails, and I think about that primarily from a scientific view and also my point of view as a Christian. I would point to actual scripture in the Bible that says that that's not even really an effective way to find God. I would go further to say, once again from a Christian point of view, that the only way that I know that God exists, that he's good and he wants to be known, is through the effort that he made to reveal himself to us, through the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's my point of view. If you want to know more about that, I put a couple of links up here. You can feel free to follow through on that and ask me questions about it later. Even you can check it on your phone and we can talk about it. All right, so let's go back now to this whole argument, though. That's our agreement. I think it's actually pretty substantial. But I think the big problem with this idea that science proves atheism is, first of all, circularity. So science, at its core, has this fundamental assumption that everything is explained by purely natural causes. It's called the rule of methodological naturalism. It basically says when we consider different ways to explain things in the world, we rule out anything that involves something supernatural. There's a whole bunch of reasons for why we do this. The original people who kind of formulated modern science, many of them were actually Christians, and they had theological reasons for doing that. And on a very pragmatic level, it just becomes very challenging to do science if you have this infinitely powerful explanatory force. And if our purpose is to really understand how the world works, it's just not that helpful. But if that's a rule in science, that's like in its fundamental assumptions, it can't really ever tell us anything about God. From before we even look at the evidence, we rule out the idea that God is there. So there's something very circular about that line of reasoning. The next point I would say, too, is that one way to look at science, and I know not every scientist looks at it this way, is that God actually explains why science is successful. Science is a human study of how the world works, and we go out into science expecting to see patterns that make sense of it. And we don't know ahead of time if those patterns are going to exist, but instead we just go to look. And we do that in the faith and the hope that there'll be something out there. Now, the early scientists, many of them were Christians, and they explained that the reason why they had hope for that is because there was a rational God. So they didn't look to science to prove creation. It was rather they saw creation as a reason to believe that science could work. And I think that actually makes sense. In a sense, this is not post hoc argumentation of me in the 21st century looking back and saying that's what explains what science works. This is actually was the reasoning for why people even started the whole scientific endeavor in the first place. It was justified from this theological belief that God existed, he was rational, and he created an ordered and intelligible world. So once again, you could say science implies atheism, but another way to look at it is science actually validates that founding assumption that the world is created. Finally, I would say that science does not actually explain everything that's important. Science is very successful at understanding the natural world. I love science in that regard. I'm drawn to it. I see incredible beauty and mystery in it. But science doesn't consider God, and it doesn't consider lots of things that aren't testable. So there's several vast and important domains that aren't really well addressed scientifically. So the distinction between right and wrong, spiritual experience, even just things like art and beauty, and love and altruism, rules for civil society. Now, I'm not trying to say that you can't ask scientific questions about these things, but my impression, usually when we start talking about that, is it starts to feel like we're talking about the shadow of something rather than the reality of it. Most studies in science about altruism are a great example of this. They study something that is similar to the word altruism, but nothing that quite compares to what we see when we see someone like Mother Teresa, someone who has like this incredible self-sacrificing love. I mean, it's something that really transcends the scientific description. I'm not trying to say that science is false in these statements, but there's something that really feels profoundly incomplete about it. It's almost like it's talking and analyzing the shadow of something that isn't the actual reality of that thing. The shadow is real, but it's not the thing itself, if that makes any sense. So then that kind of gets to, if I don't see evidence in science or in nature that clearly points to God, I think you can interpret God as nature as a product of creation or as something that runs independent of a creator. It's not really clear. Then why would I believe in God? And I think the reason for me is that I believe that no human effort could ever bring me to a transcendent God. The only way I could ever encounter God is if he chose to reveal himself to us. And maybe if God existed, he wouldn't, and I would just never know. But when I look at the history of our world, the world that we all share, I see evidence that God reached out and made himself known to us in the person of Jesus Christ. And he proved that Jesus was actually from God by raising him from the dead after 3 days. And I think it's only through this intentional act of God that I have any hope of knowing that God exists and that he is good and that he wants to be known. Now, I don't know that just because I accept the authority of the Bible and therefore I believe what it tells me. I think there's actually evidence in this world that seems to point to the truth of that. If we're going to talk about that, I'm sure, but for those of you that are curious, I'd point to 2 books. One was More Than a Carpenter, which is a book that I read when I was in junior high, which really kind of helped me kind of figure out, well, is there anything beyond just what my parents taught me, just what my personal experience is, beyond just an idea that's beautiful, that makes sense about this? And I really encountered an explanation of who Jesus was in history that made sense to me there. The other book I'd really point to is The Language of God by Francis Collins. Francis Collins is the head of the NIH. He's a really well-known scientist. He's a Christian, too. He was an atheist during graduate school until he had a change in course in his life, which I can talk about later, too, if you're curious, where he encountered Jesus. And he talks about the reasons why he came to believe that the death and resurrection of Jesus is real. So with that, this is my final slide. I do want to point you to some more information. So first of all, I'm going to be putting the slides for this and all that sort of stuff up on that blog. If you follow me on Twitter, I'll let you know when it comes up. And there'll be more coming over this next month. I'm going to do a couple more Veritas forms over the next couple months. And also, I think because of my position, too, it puts me in a different place than a lot of Christians. A lot of Christians are really intent on proving that God exists in nature. I don't really know if that's possible from what I read in Scripture. And so I'm kind of thinking about this notion of creation pacifism, this idea that we don't really need to really engage in the creation wars. So if you want to know more about that, that's another place you can engage. So that's my thoughts, and I'd love to hear what Soazig has to say, and we'll go from there.
Good evening. Oh, it's working. Wonderful. I need to put my own slides. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers for putting this together. They've been working hard, obviously, given how full this room is. So thank you very much. All right, so I was asked to talk about my research, my background, and my worldview. And then I was asked to specifically address the question that serves as a title for this event. So that's what I'm going to do. All right, so who am I? As far as my professional life is concerned, I'm a philosopher of science. That means that I spend my time thinking about how science works. I worked for a long time on the conceptual foundations of quantum physics. This is a nice cat, right? You've heard about that cat. And recently I got interested in more in sciences that people consider messier than physics, like ecology. So that's what I do, when I'm not doing this, which is really unusual. I am in front of my computer with my door closed, and in my books and equations, and I try to figure out what science is, how it works, and why it works well. So how did I get there? So a little background. As far as I can remember, I always loved mathematics. I remember in middle school, I was spending my Sunday mornings trying to figure out all the problems in my geometry book. I thought that it was absolutely fascinating that I could find out some truth using my reason in a systematic way. I love that. I truly believe that mathematics are beautiful. In high school, I fell in love with physics, not so much for the hands-on experimental part of it. What really fascinated me was that you could build mathematical models, mathematical models, and that somehow would fit well enough the world, which is seems like a messy place, so that we could get good predictions. So this is the growth of a snail is logarithmic growth. So that's one of the things that I thought was absolutely amazing. Okay, so after that, what is the undergrad looking like? It's a little bit of a mess. So long story short, I started as a math and physics major. And then I discovered the humanities and philosophy, so I went to philosophy, and then I got lucky to discovered philosophy of science, which allows you to precisely take a step back from science, not do the scientific work, but actually thinking at the meta level about what science is. So that's basically the background. I fell in love with philosophy because philosophy gives you the most comprehensive and effective tools to address some of the most fundamental questions there are in the world. What exists? How do we know? And what should we do? I thought it was pretty cool to do that and have systematic ways to think about those questions. And I fell in love with philosophy of science because precisely it gave me a chance to finally address that question that none of my physics professors really wanted to address, which is that, how come that it works? How come that we can build mathematical models of the world and that it fits well enough that we can make good predictions? How come that it's successful? And how come that we believe scientists more than other random people for many things? Okay, so that's the background. Now the worldview, given the background, you can imagine I'm a science enthusiast. I'm not going to hear from me that science is not worth doing. I love it. I'm also an atheist. I didn't speak much about it, but I happen to be an atheist. Pretty convinced one too. It would take a lot to change that, I believe. And I was saying it's kind of funny because I teach that class, Intro to Modern Philosophy, in which I try not to say what I believe, but we go over a lot of proof of the existence of God that were developed by philosophers, and I try to teach them as convincingly as possible. But so there you go. I don't buy into any of them. I know some of you have been wondering. No. Anyway, but I am a philosopher. mostly. If you ask me what my worldview, I'm a philosopher, which means that, I advocate a healthy dose of skepticism in about almost everything. And I try to keep an open mind. I've changed my beliefs about many things in the course of my life. And how did that happen? Well, I strive to listen to what other people have to do. And then I try my best to let my beliefs go where the conceptual and the empirical evidence go. I don't try to have preconceptions. I try to look into the reasons that are behind our beliefs. So that's for the worldview. All right, so now the specific questions. Does science point to atheism? Josh and I are going to agree largely, and the answer is no. So you can go home. Sorry. Now there's way more to say, right? So first off, I have to say, obviously you've noticed I'm not a native, right? You've heard that accent. So I'm coming from Europe, from France, and I have to say, to me, it's been quite surprising to see how much debate there is about this, because I grew up in a place where there is no question. It's not even an issue that science and religion could be in conflict or not going along together. So, as a young student, I spent countless nights conversing with my friends about deep metaphysical questions. That's what we do when we're young, right? You have actually that time to do that. And you drink quite a bit with it, well, whatever. Anyway, so the four people that would come up to stay up late during those nights usually were two philosophers, one atheist, one Catholic, and two physicists, one atheist, one Catholic. And many times we ask ourselves, why we asked the others, and I asked, and the other atheists asked, why are you believing in this thing? Or why are you Catholic of all things? And not a single time, and we did that several times, I promise you. We've been through those conversations several times. Not a single night it came to our mind, crossed our mind to ask to the physicist Catholic, why, how can you, don't you think there's a conflict between your being a scientist and your being a Catholic? Not even once. Like that was not, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about the problem of evil, we talked about benevolence and omnipotence, we talked about free will and predetermination, we talked about all those things. Fascinating issues, right? But science, no. So that's one thing. And then as Josh has said, there are centuries, if you do a little history of science, HPS, right? And there's a class that you can take when you talk about all those guys who invented modern science. At the 200 level, it's double dip, to Janet. Sorry. Introduction to History and Philosophy of Science. Okay, done with this. So if you look at the history of science, all the big names, right? So we heard of Bacon, but think about also Newton. Think about Einstein. None of those guys, and pretty big names, right? Reasonably big names. None of those guys thought there was an issue there. Quite the opposite. You see that's God as a geometer. Right? Exactly as Josh has said. God is the one who gave the world the laws of nature, who ordered the world the way it is. And he gave us some faculties, right? Sense perception and rational reasoning. And it is our duty to honor those faculties and to look around and to figure out what the laws of nature are. And so there are centuries of history of science where this was not an issue, right? So again, it's a surprising question, but it's still an important one here. So let's address it. What is the answer? Of course not. So no, science doesn't point to atheism. Science doesn't point to theism either. Science just doesn't address that issue. Science is what? You build mathematical models of the inner workings of natural world on the basis of empirical data. So if you're a scientist, you go and you look around and you say, wow, this is really cool. I want to know how this works. So you go and you take some measurement, and with your measurements, you try to build a model that fits the data and is aimed at representing the real world, right? So that's what you do. And that's great. It's a wonderful, wonderful, absolutely amazing and human endeavor, and we've been very successful at doing it. Now, there are tons of issues that science simply doesn't address, right? Does science tell you that torturing an infant for pleasure is wrong? No. Does science tell you that freedom is something that we should protect as much as we can? No. Does science tell you that Mozart is one of the greatest composers in the history of humanity? No. So to me, the question of the existence of God is one of those questions that simply fall outside of the domain of science. So it's of course not. So when do we have a clash then? Because obviously some people think we have a clash. And I think that roughly two cases that are very similar, and both of them is an outrage. This is a guy who is going in between the natural world and the metaphysical world. And so it's basically someone who is reaching out too far outside of their legitimate domain. So on one hand, and Josh talked about them, or at least one of them, it was on one of his slides, some scientists put a metaphysical gloss over the scientific theories. That metaphysical gloss is not well founded in the science. And the metaphysical gloss does conflict with some claims that come from religious texts. Okay, so that's one case. And on the other hand, some religious people take their religious text to give us details about the inner workings of nature. And those claims are not necessarily well-founded theologically, and those claims sometimes conflict with some scientific facts that are well established. So what do we do with those two kinds of claims? I think we do the same thing, we ignore them, because they're not legitimate. They're going out of their legitimate domain, and so that's just, fine with them, but you don't have to listen to them. That's my point. All right, and so here's the conclusion. To take, basically, I'm a science enthusiast. I'm a convinced atheist, but I am not an atheist because I'm a science enthusiast. Those things are completely independent. That's about it. Thank you. Are we turning this off?
I think I'll get
Whatever.
it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks to both of you for those very stimulating introductory remarks. So I want to just start the conversation by first giving you an opportunity to just either do a brief response to each other's presentation or to ask a question that was most raised for you by each other's presentation.
Yeah, can I start?
Yeah, absolutely.
So first off, I do want to say we didn't stack the deck. I had no idea what you were going to say about this. I had no idea we were going to agree so much. Did you? But I guess my question is that there's a lot of atheists in the United States, and I would even say in England, like Richard Dawkins is from England, who really try and make the strong argument that, evolution really shows that God isn't necessary, and that, maybe he doesn't prove he doesn't exist, but it's just kind of a very obsolete belief. Like, what would you say to them exactly to make your case? Because they really use science as the reason why that other people should become atheists too. And it sounds like you disagree with that, so how would you answer them?
Look, so it really depends on what situation you are. If you are in a situation where you have to answer some people who are trying to find God in the gaps of science, right? So they say, oh, look, you haven't explained that, so that must be that God is there. Then I would say, yes, science can live without, science is fine. There is no need to God. So if it's not necessary, if the claim is that God is not necessary for science to do his job, then I'm fine with that claim. Now, if we go further and we said, just because it's not necessary, hence it doesn't exist, that doesn't follow, that's bad logic, right? it's just bad logic. It's not necessary for me to have kids, but, it doesn't follow I don't have any. Sorry. So and I would expect, I would expect like minimal logic to be, a good criteria for a good argument.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that.
So a question about for you. So I guess it's did you? I'm genuinely curious about this. Did you find it difficult to find a way to put your scientific work and your faith together, or was it, or were you always that clear, or what are the kinds of struggles that you've been through?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I didn't grow up in Europe. I grew up here in the United States. In the United States, we're really accustomed to this gigantic culture war, of which the creation wars are just part of it. And I was part of that too. I think a really common experience for a lot of students in science, if they have a religious background, is to just really feel all of that conflict internally. We're told that a central part of our faith is believing very specific, detailed things about how God created us. And so that was really a challenge, because there was just such a big disconnect between what science taught and what I heard is so central to my faith. One thing that really helped a lot was really reading the Bible and seeing what the core of the Bible is. And there's some really clear statements about what the core of our faith is. It says that the cornerstone is what? Jesus, right? So is it creation? It's funny, this is like a simple truth that most Christians kind of almost know. You've read those verses that Jesus is the cornerstone. You never see anything that points to creation being the cornerstone, yet somehow there's something that's happened in the church that's really confused us. But when I realized that I don't actually have to follow confused Christians, I actually just have to follow, what Jesus tells me in the Bible, it became a lot easier. Amen?
Thank you. Josh, your talk concluded with statements that sort of raised a question for me, almost spoken. Truly, as a scientist, you suggested at the end, why do you believe in God? Well, it is that the proof was that Jesus was raised from the dead, and that there wasn't just a sort of scriptural testimony to this, but there seemed to be other elements that suggested the truth of that statement as well. And so I'm kind of wondering, I guess, it really does seem like your belief is based on evidence. And I'm wondering sort of how you would describe the sort of status of that evidence relative to other scientific claims for which we look for evidence. And secondly, what's the role, and this would be for both of you, what does the role for faith ultimately play in terms of accepting certain things that are unprovable in your worldviews?
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in there. So there's a couple things that require clarification. First of all, I would start by saying my understanding of faith is not what we generally think about faith. Faith, we kind of think about it as a religion or as unsubstantiated belief. I think a better understanding for me is the notion of trust. Okay. So when I talk about faith, I'm really saying I trust something. Okay, just to be clear, that's how I use it, and you can think about it differently. And then also, when I said not necessarily Scripture, what I'm saying is that I don't have to start with the belief that Scripture is the authoritative truth to use it as evidence. I think that there's actually ancient manuscripts that I can just treat as not necessarily authoritative, but just evidence that exists in this world. That's public evidence that everyone agrees exists, that things were said, and that there was testimony made. There's also evidence outside of those scriptures too. For example, something that's outside of the scriptures is that there's something very common across cultures, across gender, across ethnicity, across languages, about people from all these different places describing a very real experience with a God. And they connect that to this event that happened 2,000 years ago. Now, I'm not saying that this is definitive, but it does raise a lot of questions. There's very few things in this world that have that gigantic reach. and then I came to experience it for myself in a very real way too. So first I saw it in other people, I saw it in myself. I would call that a type of evidence. It's a public evidence in this world. Another thing I would really point to too is the remarkable spread of the church under intense murderous persecution in the first couple centuries without any political power. I think that's a really key point. If you look at most major religions, they spread with political power and force, but in the early centuries, the church spread with the murderous persecution of Nero. And it just doesn't make sense historically. Why would that happen if it was built entirely on a lie? There was people alive at that time that really believed they'd seen something, I believe, and that makes me give extra weight to them. Now, not all the apostles died for the faith, but it really seems clear that all of them were willing to die for what they were saying about Jesus. It doesn't have the features that we normally see in conspiracies. It wasn't to promote a human authority, even though often churches do kind of take it and use that authority for themselves. At that time, that's not really what was going on, and I just find that very compelling. I don't really know how to explain all of that, including my experience, and understand that apart from Jesus. And it's not so much that like my confidence like goes up and down on a day-to-day basis as we get more and more evidence. I mean, there's a time in my life I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, does this make sense? And looking away, well, I think that the evidence isn't definitive, but it leads me to the question, am I going to trust this? And I made a decision to trust it. And in that, I really came to encounter a living God.
Yeah, so I guess that in terms of the concept of faith as trust, I was thinking the idea of the sort of grasping of things unseen and accepting them as true. And to a certain extent, you're saying it's not definitive. You do reach that point. And I guess, well, you can respond, but then, Soazig, I guess is there an element of faith in terms of things that you accept to be true that are not scientifically?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm a humanist. I trust that every single human being has something good about it. And not everybody agrees, and I have some evidence in favor of that, and there's some pretty strong evidence that there are some truly evil people out there. And you know what? I just want to believe that every single human being has something good about it. And that's my little faith. My faith, it's not little, but so it's not about God, but it is a similar sense of trust that there is some evidence that we can do amazing things. There's some pretty convincing evidence that we can do amazing things. There's also some very strong evidence that we can be absolutely awful. But yeah, I take that. I take the leap, and I want to trust in human beings, and maybe even more than human beings. But that's outside of this. Not for tonight. I'll stick with human beings. I'll talk about animals later.
So, because one of the questions, that your talk also raised was that one that I was suggested to ask, which is what would it take to change your mind? And Josh was just talking about he sees evidence for this. Is that what it's about? I mean, if science doesn't take you there, is it simply a matter of accumulating observation and experience, and that would ultimately bring you to a place to say, well, I guess they had it right. There is a God.
Yeah. So what would it take? So extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? Because this is an extraordinary claim. We're talking about this omniscient, omnipotent, benevolent. Wow. Being. That's not a small postulation, right? Would a vision work? I would probably question my sanity before I think I encountered God. Would a miracle seen by a group of people count? Again, there are some good studies about group delusion. So again, I would not buy into that. So I don't know, so let's try to think, what's next? So let's imagine we get a message right here, I'm God. In the next 10 hours, on the hour, the sun is going to disappear. The galaxy is not going to be dismantled. You can measure everything. The sun is disappearing on the clock, every hour in the next 10 hours. Okay. So if that happened, and it actually happened, that sun disappears, nobody's dismantling.
How would you know that wasn't just a delusion?
Exactly, the trick is that I would postulate first like an alien civilization that was way more advanced technologically than we are, right? Because if you could imagine us without technology, we can make miracles for some people, right? We can make it, miracles. Okay, so that would not work either. So I was really, I'm trying hard.
Well,
so next, so I guess, it would take some miracles because we need the omnipotent. So we need to have some objectively unanimous testimony, witness that something that really goes, what we take to be the laws of nature, goes against what we take to be the laws of nature. But then I would say I would have, and I understand it's not a reasonable request to make, but I would have to have a understandable explanation of how this world could be the result of a benevolent design, an omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent design. Like if you can explain to me the problem of evil, and you do miracles, then probably.
So we were on a radio show this morning, and we were in the car kind of going back. And I don't know if any of you heard that this morning, but you were mentioning that one of the reasons why you're an atheist is because of the problem of evil.
Right.
Can you?
That's what it's one of the problems. Besides, so one is like I don't think I need God to do much of what I do in my life, but then I cannot make sense of God, which is the worst part, because otherwise, it's not because I need it, it doesn't exist, but then I could be agnostic, right?
But I guess my question too is, do you have to fully understand God before you'd be willing to accept Him?
Well, why would I accept something if I don't need it and I don't understand it?
Well, I guess when I think about it, if God really exists, one thing I'm very certain of is that I'm not going to fully understand Him.
I understand that.
And so, if we're talking about God, and I'm not a stupid person, but I also know that even if I try really hard for a long time, that if it really is God, there's going to be something like that transcends my limited ability as a human to understand. So if I want to be open to the possibility God exists, I have to be also open to the idea that I'm just not going to be able to fully understand Him.
Right, so usually you postulate the existence of unobservable entities or things that we don't have clear evidence for, absolutely clear evidence for, because you have it serves some purpose in your world.
But I guess I'm not postulating it. The way I see it is I'm not postulating it. It's like if I was trying to come out and figure out if God existed, I'm just saying I would have no ability to do that. Like if a God that's transcendent and that's all-powerful really exists, I don't even have any really reason to believe that He would even care about me.
Right.
Why would He care about like little old me in this tiny corner of the universe? The only way I have any confidence that God exists is that there seems to be evidence that He actually did reach out to me to make Himself known. And that effort that He made is what postulates that He exists. And so I'm just trying to see how I think about that proposal that He made. Or that's made in history. Maybe I decide I don't want to follow that invitation. But that's what I'm responding to more than making a personal case. I'm making a response to something I find outside myself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I understand. So there are two things here. So there is the historical evidence, and then there's the trust that, the way to make sense of that historical evidence is in terms of an omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent God. So the question is, what do we do with that historical evidence, and whether we want to make that step to the trust? And I don't see that this is, to me, the best explanation for that. It takes so much, and it's such a huge thing to suppose or to trust. I can't do that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, something happened, and Jesus definitely, was the best advertiser in the entire history of humanity.
The best what?
Advertiser.
That's advertiser.
I mean, all communication majors should learn from Jesus. Right? It's pretty amazing. He had a very important message, a very novel message that struck at the right time, at the right place. It was a really incredible message. And there's obviously a lot to learn from this.
Can I ask you more about that? Because we were talking about this in the car, too. Like, I mean, both of us sometimes are kind of struggle with many Christians that are out there. I mean, Christians aren't always, I mean, I like a lot of Christians, but some of them can be, I mean, they're family, but sometimes, you have weird uncles, right? And, you love them, but, But I think you've been frustrated by Christians too, but you've really found Jesus compelling.
Yeah, of course.
Can you tell me a little more about why you find Jesus compelling?
Look, when this idea in the world at the time, and I'm talking obviously about the Second Testament, the New Testament. The message of love. I mean, this message that you ought to love despite whatever people do to you. That's totally new at the time, right? And even if, and you don't have to stay there. I mean, you can even imagine, you can even think about the kind of message you have about helping others and trying to reach out. And I mean, those are absolutely amazing, beautiful things, right? And I mean, I take the Bible as a book of wisdom. It's not like I'm putting the Bible in the trash. I read philosophy, I read Aristotle, I read Plato, I read the Bible, right? I mean, I take it, and there are lots of books of wisdom. The Bible's been here for, a long time as one of the most read books. It's probably because there is something interesting in there. And there is. And so, the message of love is something very compelling. The message that you have to go and reach out to others is very compelling. I'll take that home any day. Any day.
I had a student, sometimes you can say unexpectedly you're surprised by their profundity. On an exam, in response to an exam question, wrote, "If the idea of God were so simple, the Bible would probably be shorter." And I guess what your comments sort of raised to me was, it seems to me one of the common stumbling blocks for scientists and for a lot of people in this sort of, in our history of the tradition since the Enlightenment, is that where they stumble in putting it together is the difficulty of science reconciling, not with a sort of God in general, but a particular version of God, which sets up this problem of evil, right? So God as the all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient, all-good God, how can there be suffering? Many would argue this isn't necessarily, that's the Neoplatonic, Augustinian God that isn't even the God of the Old Testament. And so it seems to me where the clash between religion and science, and the more science evidence-minded folks, and both of you seem to be relying on evidence for your beliefs or lack thereof.
Well, I mean, it's also an experience, right? I'm saying that there is evidence. That's how I know my experience with God is beyond just like a personal preference or like a fantasy. But I do agree with what you're saying. So, I mean, kind of getting to this issue of the problem of evil. So my starting point before some Platonic notion of what God is, and I know Christians will say things like God is omnipotent and he's all good and all that, and we all have different meanings of what that is, and if you choose the right meanings, that's completely inconsistent. If you choose other meanings, it can fit together. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the right definition of those things is in the first place. Like, when I think that God is good, what that means, I start with Jesus, and I see that what it means when we say that God is good is that he's willing to die for peace. That he's willing to die for his enemy, not just his friend, but his enemy, to have peace with them. And that's like something that's so otherworldly. And that's kind of where my starting point is for what good is. When I look at Jesus too, I look at this notion that God has this desire and ability to intervene in history. And he does very intentionally for his purposes, but he also isn't doing this haphazardly. He has like a purpose in it. So his notion of omnipotence is different than maybe what mine would be, where I would just use all that power for my benefit or just for other reasons. And also in terms of suffering, I think one thing that I find in the cross too is that, yeah, this world has a great deal of suffering in it and a lot of evil, but what I find in Jesus is two things to address that. One is that God is not saying, I'm God and you're humans and you suffer alone. He's saying, rather, I'm going to enter into that suffering with you. Two, I find out that he speaks of another world where things are made right. So there's actually something very profound about my faith in the sense that even when this world is completely unjust, it doesn't destroy the faith of a Christian. In fact, that faith grows stronger because there's this understanding that there is something after this world in which all things are made right. So if you look only at this side of the world, it looks unjust. But what we find out through Jesus is that there's something that happens after death that equalizes all things. And so I think our world looks unjust, but there's this day of the Lord where he makes everything right. Now, I know that's like crazy and it's out there, but I only kind of come to know that through Jesus. So I think there's an answer to it. I think he makes sense of it, but it's not always the answer that we want, and it doesn't always, it's not always entirely comprehensible. I mean, we can definitely look at cases where we just don't understand. So I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So we'll get rewarded for our pains. So first off, of course, I fully understand that. I mean, that's to a large extent the end of the book of Job.
Yeah. Well, there's that history, right, of like talking about how, I mean, like, it's not like suffering is independent of how the Bible talks about God. It's actually deeply enmeshed in it. I mean, it talks about Jesus willingly choosing suffering.
But yeah, so I mean, I understand that answer, and I think, you have to come up for an answer, and I respect that answer. I can't buy into it, though. I mean, I find that the level of suffering and random suffering and unjust suffering is such. In a sense, if you think about the book of Job, I would say that I prefer the answer within the book rather than, in the beginning and the end, that's probably added later anyway. Actually, definitely added if I believe, the guys who do religious studies, which is not my field. So I might, I'm not an expert on this, but I have expert friends who do that for a living.
You have faith in them.
And I actually trust their testimony because, they're experts and, they have PhDs and stuff.
All right, if I get to your point, I want to know your point.
Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think that, and to me, the most, if I had to give an answer to the problem and during this long night, long night conversation that I have, night-long conversations that I have with my friends, I think that to me, rather than the reward, which I find kind of distasteful, they say that.
But I didn't say reward. You said
yeah,
reward.
I know. Well, there's another world in which everything are made right. So that it's not punishment and reward. What is it?
Well, I didn't say reward. I know
you did not, but that's make things right. I don't know what it means, but all right. So I just don't see how we can justify the random suffering of kids. And I don't need to have any example here. Everybody can have their own image of absolutely awful suffering. We don't need any gruesome stuff here. So I just don't see how that can be justified with just saying that there's an afterlife where everything will be made right, whether it's in terms of rewards, punishment. Now, the answer that I think is most compelling, if I had to find the best answer I can find for the other person, from what I understood with all those conversations and conversations with other people, because that's an ongoing conversation, is the middle of the book of Job, when it's like, who are you to ask, which is also something that you mentioned, which is like, I'm expecting not to understand everything, right? And I think that's a fair answer, but again, at that point, then I need a compelling reason to believe in this inexplicable, ununderstandable being, and I don't see what work it does for me, and I don't feel compelled to it by anything.
Okay, so I'd like to move us toward the audience questions here. Maybe while I'll invite people to queue up at the microphones. I'll have one question to get us started. So please approach a microphone if you have a question, and again, try to keep the question succinct and make it a question rather than a statement.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
My question is for Josh. You kept repeatedly saying that God is good and Jesus is just, but how can you make that claim when failure to abide by Jesus' claim or buy into his gimmick is an eternity of torture in hell? If Jesus is just, shouldn't you have the ability to choose without fear of punishment?
So you're saying is how do I say that God is good? Why I say because that there's consequences, there might be consequences for how we respond to him?
Well, consequences for failure to buying into Jesus as God. Like the only unforgivable sin is doubting that Jesus is the Son of God. So if you doubt, you go to hell. If you go to hell, that's not exactly just.
Look, I'm sure you've heard that from Christians. I think, I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think the reason why I know God is good is not because I understand all the things about his justice. What I would say it's more that I see a God that's willing to die for the person that's his enemy. So even a person that rejects him, I think God loves that person more than that person deserves. I think God loves me more than I deserve. And he's willing to do everything possible to make a connection to that person and to me. That's all I'm saying. And, beyond that, I think there's...
Is he just in the same sense as when he asked Abraham to murder his own son to prove his love to God?
We need to... we've got a
Jesus
number of
is
people
God,
here.
not
Yeah,
forget.
so I'll just say that when I say just, I'm not saying that it's something, even the idea of what justice is in our world, there's great disagreement about what that is. So just because there's disagreement about what that justice is doesn't mean it's not just. I think that we have to wonder if, we can even really understand that justice. Anyways, go on to the next person.
Yeah, we'll just alternate back and forth. And again, I know these are huge questions, and we've had a wide-ranging discussion, but we'll try to keep it to the science, theism, atheism question. So next.
Great. Okay. So my question is also for Josh. I understand you feel that science is, in a sense, studying a shadow and just inherently can't find God since it's considering the options outside of that, correct?
Yeah, I would even say that a large proportion of philosophers of science agree with me on that.
Great. Okay. So just with that established, and that science can't really explain the beautiful and ordered nature of the universe, so I'm just curious why this points to Christianity specifically as opposed to all the other explanations of the universe out there, such as Judaism, Buddhism,
Sure.
Hinduism.
Well, I would say it doesn't point to Christianity specifically, which is why I don't really look to nature to prove Christianity at all. I agree with that. I think it's actually kind of weird to me that Christians are so focused on proving God from nature, because all that proves is that God might exist. It doesn't tell you that he's good. Maybe God exists and he's evil, and if we choose to follow that evil God, we might do evil things. That's kind of terrifying. And so I actually really agree with a lot of atheists in being really scared of theism. I think it's only Jesus that gives me confidence, in that there's a God out there that exists that's truly good, that's willing to die for peace, and that's not going to lead me to war.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. I think my question is probably more for Josh, but I'm curious, both of you. But because God only reveals itself through the words and actions of human beings, why do we need to separate it from humans? And doesn't that fact kind of point strongly towards a secular humanism?
I guess I don't understand the question exactly. Do you?
So God only is able to reveal itself through human beings.
I guess where did you get that from?
That your idea would be something like the fact that he believes that Jesus died for his enemies has been done by a human being, and that gives you faith in human beings, and not you don't need to put a God in there.
Yeah. So we came up with this idea of God. Human beings did. So why would we need to separate it from human beings? Because God can only speak to us through other humans.
I see what you're saying. Well, I guess I wonder about that history. I don't know if humans came up with the idea of God. That's the first thing. I mean, you'd have to give me, I mean, there's not really clear evidence that's the case unless you start with the assumption that God doesn't exist. The second thing is, I think my confidence comes through Jesus, but believing in Jesus, then I see God everywhere. So I'm not trying to say God isn't everywhere. I mean, I see God in nature. I just don't think it points to a good God necessarily unless I already know that a good God exists through Jesus. So it's kind of like through the lens of Jesus, I start seeing God everywhere. Okay. But, and it's not just through people, it's other places. And in the world, it's kind of like this world-illuminating light that makes sense of everything. But it's not those, even though I see God clearly in nature, that's not how I know that God exists, if that makes any sense.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. My question's for Dr. Le Bihan?
Yeah.
Le Bihan, close enough?
That's
Sorry.
very close. Thank you
Yeah.
for worrying about it.
So my question is, as a scientist, I understand that I never really seek to prove anything. I can really only objectionably seek to disprove things. The idea is falsifiability, as I understand it, and as kind of espoused with Karl Popper. So my question is for you, when you were kind of struggling with the question from the moderator of how would someone prove God to you, what about the question, how would someone disprove God, and is that even possible with a metaphysical claim?
Good question. Probably. So the idea that so first off, the idea that in science you disprove only Popper is fine, but we have other guys thinking about philosophy of science. But it's still a very good question, and it is true that. So how would you disprove God within the sciences? As I said, I don't think you can do that. I mean, someone can always say that beyond whatever you find out with the scientific method, there is something else that gives them faith. And I think that science doesn't have an answer to that.
But there's like an intrinsic circularity to saying things, because science at its core doesn't consider God. You can't directly say anything about God. It doesn't speak of God. Like, it doesn't say anything about him directly. So, I mean, we have to go to philosophy to start making claims.
Yeah, it's because philosophy rocks. Sorry. So, yeah, I don't think you could disprove God with science only. I don't think so. I don't see how you would go about to do that, right?
I guess my question is maybe not, are you looking to disprove it, but to vitiate the claim by saying that there's just as much evidence for these things that can never be disproven, like God, as there is for magical leprechauns that live in my fridge, for instance?
I don't know. I mean, I know, like, a lot of atheists make that argument, like, I forgot it was, like, there's like some pink monster behind the moon or something, like I haven't observed it or whatever. I think that that's kind of missing something here, that this isn't like I'm just making a random proposition out of nowhere. I mean, there's like, we're kind of embedded in a history, in a world, like this is actually rooted in embedded not in like my personal random crazy claim. No one's making that claim. You're not seeing a claim across all cultures and languages and ethnicities and socioeconomic statuses that there's leprechauns in your fridge. Like, rather we're seeing that about God, and that gives it some more weight. And then moreover, as a Christian, I point to the evidence of Jesus, and that's once again something in the public evidence of history. Now, I mean, you can choose to not believe that. I mean, that's an entirely valid position. But it's also entirely valid to look at that and accept that invitation to belief. I mean, I think there's much more evidence for God than there is for leprechauns in your fridge.
Next question, please.
Thank you.
Or did you have a...
No, I'm...
Okay.
This is a question for Josh. You're a scientist and you're also a Christian, and when I hear that, I tend to think of evolution versus creation, and I was wondering where you stand on that, if you have more faith in one versus the other, and if so, what your reasoning is behind it.
Yeah, so I'm going to say two things about that, and I'd be actually really curious to invite you to talk about this too, Soazig. But so first of all, I'll tell you about what I think, but then I also want to dignify some Christians that think differently than me about this, and so both these things might be surprising to Christians. So in terms of what I believe, I'm really comfortable with evolution as the way how God created us. I see it really similar to embryology being the way how he knits us together in our mother's womb. It's just a description of how he did it, and I'm really comfortable with that. I know that really freaks out a lot of Christians that are here. I will go on to say that I understand why some Christians believe in six-day creation. And the reason why is not, so the reason that's given, which I think is confusing to me and a lot of scientists, is that the evidence points to six-day creation. I would say I disagree with that. What I would rather say is that you came to a real experience with Jesus, and from that came to trust the Bible, and as you were studying the Bible, you came to really believe that it said there was six-day creation in the last 10,000 years. And because it's a trustworthy source, there's nothing actually illogical about that statement. It's entirely possible that God made an earth recently that looks old, and that's a logically coherent position. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I think that makes sense if it's rooted in Jesus rather than in evidence. So that makes sense to me. So I see there's dignity in that position, even though I disagree with it. But I personally am really comfortable with the idea that God created things through evolution.
Okay. So I can say, so evolution happens, right? It just happens. And so how it happens, we might discuss how exactly it happens, but exactly are the laws. Just like gravitation happens. How it happens, whether Newton or Einstein is right, that's a different question. But evolution happens, just like gravitation happens. Now, my take on this is if the Bible was supposed to be a physics or biology manual, I think God would have done a better job. I would have quantum field theory in there. Maybe we could have quantum gravity, finally, right? It would be in there.
Maybe it's there, we just don't know the notation.
So the Bible is not a good science manual. It doesn't pass the consistency test. Right? It is inconsistent. Right? So how long is the flood? Like 40 days, 7 days, 600 days, 10 months? It's all on there. You can go and read the Genesis tonight. You'll find all of those numbers. So the creation, we have two stories of creation in Genesis, right? That are inconsistent. So what do you do with that? Do you say, this is just a bunch of crap, I'm just not reading this anymore? No, you don't say that because, again, I have a high respect for books, especially ancient books. I think they're really cool. And and if they stay long enough, there's probably there's something in there. So the way I see it is that the Bible does not, even if it is, there's a lot of God stuff in there. There's an actual God. And there's revelation in the Bible. It's not about biology and physics. That's our job, right? That's our work. He didn't do the work for us. So the Bible is about edification, about moral improvement. The creation stories are about our role and status towards God. It's not an empirical claim. It's how...
Are you becoming a theologian now? Or?
What? No, I'm not. I don't know anything about religion. So, I know a little bit, but look, I think it's really about how we are towards God, how God is towards us. And you have to learn, and no easy answer is to be found in those pages. That's what, in a sense, that's what the consistency is about. It's because there is no easy answer to those questions, and you need to figure it out. The hard work is not done for you. You've got your brains, use it.
So,
sorry.
Just to interject here, it seems like part of what you're raising is that if you see the Bible as an authoritative source, and believers typically do, then how one regards that source is going to be key to the extent to which you see science and religion in conflict. A scientific materialist and a biblical literalist are going to have the hardest times reconciling the two, but there are many ways to conceive of how the Bible functions to convey truth, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. First off, when I look at the Bible, I think it has a purpose in this world, that it has not failed. And I can look at the Bible to read it to find out what its purpose is. And its purpose, that the Bible tells me its purpose is, to bring me to correct knowledge of who Jesus is. And I think it does not fail in that. And I know this is a little bit controversial, but let me just put this out there. I think that one of the great tragedies right now in science for Christians is that in science, Christianity is only known for being opposed to evolution. And I want to ask the audience, I want to ask you, what is more compelling, and especially for those of you that aren't Christian, what's more compelling about our faith? Is it anti-evolutionism or is it Jesus? How many of you think it's anti-evolutionism? That's like super compelling about the Christian faith. How many think if there's anything that's interesting about the Christian faith, it might be Jesus? All right, so that's the tragedy. Yeah. That's, I think, the great tragedy of what's happening among Christians in science right now, that it's just getting caught up in something that's not even really that interesting.
So Jesus was a great advertiser. Recent Christians are not.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, I understand why a lot of Christians reject evolution, but let me just say the best reason to reject evolution is because you trust the Bible, because you trust Jesus. I mean, that's the only rational way I can see to reject evolution. I think a lot of the arguments about science really, I don't really find that compelling. I don't really know any of my colleagues that find them compelling that are non-Christians. And so it's just, if you really care about convincing people not to believe in evolution, you should probably start with Jesus.
Okay, I'm told we have about 10 minutes left, and I know the lines are long, so I'm not promising those towards the back will be able to get your questions at least from the microphone. Anyway, we'll do the best we can, so just try to be succinct answers, and we'll try to move through as we can. So I think next over here.
Ma'am, you called yourself a convinced atheist. If scientific evidence cannot convince one way or another, what convinced you?
Random suffering.
Random suffering, is what she said.
Yeah. Unjust suffering. Kids dying 0 to 5 every 5 seconds, one kid every 5 seconds in Africa from lack of food, clean water, or basic medication. We can start counting now. Every 5 seconds.
Thank you.
That was succinct enough?
Okay, that was perfect.
Yes.
I'll try to adjust my question based on the answers you gave, but I just want to prime my question first by acknowledging the context in which we live in today, and by saying the last 15 years has been full of a very turbulent social episode and has incubated lots of hate and reasons for that. And science nor religion has seemed to do much to alleviate those symptoms. And I'm just wondering, for you, Josh, or both of you, although you both seem to have concluded that science and religion offer their strengths in the respective dimensions, I'm curious as to some examples of any major positive social, scientific, or otherwise unifying progress that is a direct result from the efforts of the modern Christian body.
Great question. That's a big question. Do you want to start with it, or maybe you don't have any thoughts?
So recent, you said, right?
Yeah,
so
hopefully last 20 years.
Not 2,000 years ago, that doesn't count. Does it count as recent
no.
or not?
Preferably not.
No? Well, so it's a tough question for me because, so I think that there is a distinction between churches, institutions, right? And the message of Jesus or message of Christianity. And religious institutions are run by men. Actually, I was thinking men, women, but no, mostly men. Except in few exceptions. And men are what they are, right? Especially men, not women. Maybe women would actually be better in that role. So, not saying anything here. I mean, don't get me too far on this. So institutions have not been that amazing at bringing up some great amount of wonderful things. But there are lots. Well, I guess my answer would be that the institution of the church hasn't been very good as an institution as bringing good in the world. But I do believe that there are lots of people who are inspired by religion, individuals that are inspired by religion and do good things due to that inspiration.
So I would say that it's actually more complicated than that. So I would say that I can't say very much good about Christian involvement in politics. And I think one of the really positive things that's happened over the last 15 years is that Christians have become much more disillusioned about their role in politics and looking to other places for influence. And there's something that's interesting about how Christians think about influence in the world. They do actually quite a lot of good, but they don't tend to advertise themselves very well about it. I think that's actually some of the stuff that's been most compelling about the Christian faith for me, is just how commonplace immense personal sacrifice for other people is. But you don't see it in the afternoon news. You don't see, I mean, you know, if you think Christianity is Ted Cruz, I just really am really sad for you. You know, like, I mean, I just want you to know that I really struggle to love him as a brother in Christ. I think
we have a kind of a wonderful Pope right now.
Yeah,
I would agree with that entirely.
You know, who just actually did something political, right? Saying that only building walls is not Christian. That's a big move. Those are big moves, and he's making big moves. So
I'll try to describe something that happened today. So Soazig didn't know most of the people organizing the event. I think she took a major risk in actually meeting and hanging out with a ton of Christians, right? So thank you for doing that. That deserves like an applause, right? So thank you for doing that. And I remember, I mean, we were kind of talking before. I think you were genuinely surprised at how nice some of these Christians were.
I assumed when I got that first email, I assumed that it would be very aggressive and trying to knock me down.
Yeah, and I think you found that these are people that respect you even though you're different.
Yeah.
And I would say that if you really want to see firsthand what Christianity can do,
My best friend happens to be an evangelist.
Yeah, well, I would just encourage you to talk to some of the Christians here and to ask them, hey, what's going on here that I can come take a part of to find out what really Christianity is about? Like, how are you guys serving the poor? How are you guys laying down your rights for other people? How are you guys pursuing peace? And I'll tell you that there's this hidden movement. It's silent. It's not drawing attention to itself. It's not out there to get favor from you or anyone. It's really just seeking favor from the Lord and really truly pursuing peace in this world. And that's the hidden silent church that you do not really see play out in politics at all, and that's how most of us encounter Christianity. But this hidden church is truly compelling. I mean, it's something that is beautiful, and it's some of the most significant things I've seen happen ever.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question.
Do we need something more than science to talk about or explain or do ethics? And if so, what else is there? What's missing?
Well, you know the answer.
To the philosophy student.
You've got a master in that discipline. I would answer philosophy. Yeah, philosophy is a way to investigate, to systematically investigate the things that we're trying to understand about ethics and morality. And it does a pretty good job at it.
Well, I would say that philosophy is the best we have, but it falls very short when it comes to the real problems of the world, like, for example, ISIS in the Middle East. Like, when we think about how people just take a hold of things that are deeply immoral and pursue all of the energy towards them, philosophy doesn't help us, I think, address that. It might help us personally.
You have to figure out that this is wrong.
Except for what if people don't want to figure out it's wrong?
Yeah, that's a sociological fact about human nature, and that's the word of sociologists. That's not my work as a philosopher.
But that's the limit of philosophy in this, right? So, I mean, like, we can't really get to, like, an ethical world through philosophy alone.
So you're making a descriptive claim about how people behave, and ethics is about how people ought to behave. So I
don't think the problem is that people don't know what's right. I think it's that people don't do what's right.
Sure, but just like Christians don't do what is Christian.
Sure.
Right? So, but that doesn't mean that being Christian doesn't mean anything, or that what you ought to do as a Christian doesn't mean anything. So, people fall short on what we ought to be doing all the time, and I do many times in my life, in my day-to-day basis, and I fall short of what I ought to be doing, and I try to improve. But how do I try to improve? On the basis of a systematic reflection on what is right and wrong. And that's informed by various ways in which philosophy has been systemizing all of this.
Thank you. Next question.
My question is about consciousness.
So I consider myself an atheist, but the one question I have a hard time answering is what happens to our consciousness as living beings, because if you understand physics, you understand that matter cannot be created or destroyed. I mean, it simply exists, and when it stops existing, it changes into something else. So what happens to, our consciousness when we die? I mean, humans, we become, sometimes we become like in a vegetative state, and we're declared totally brain dead. There's no brain waves. We're just a heart that just beats, and there's no mind. But sometimes people wake up and they have all these stories to tell, and they have this profound sense of spirituality and connection to like a higher power, and all these civilizations that were not intricately connected all have this sense of an afterlife, and a sense that, when they die, they'll enter this realm where they'll see all who they've lost. How does atheism, how does science explain something so profound as consciousness? Does it simply disappear, or does it transcend into something else?
Is that a question for me?
No, that's a question for you.
Well, thanks. It's an excellent question. I don't see that consciousness is that much more difficult to explain than the existence of hot tables and tigers and all of these. So what I mean by this is that, the science tells us that most of that table over there is empty.
Right. It's very few particles and largely empty. And still we talk about that table as being hard. And we do that all the time. That is, we use terms to talk about things at different levels, because it's useful for us to talk at different levels, and to talk about this at different levels. So, to give you another example, people could say, we are all a bunch of particles, right? Which is true, right? We are all a bunch of particles that are governed by certain laws of fundamental physics. Now, should we explain everything that happens in this room and why all those particles are here tonight? Because, a bunch of, there's a certain momentum, which could be an explanation in principle that you could give. All those particles have certain momentum, and it so happened that the forces played in a certain way that those particles ended up in this room. Well, a more useful and more interesting way to speak is that people actually came here. Those are people, not particles, and they come here because there's a meeting, and they wanted to go to the meeting. So that's what philosophers call emergence and supervenient properties, basically. And those terms won't mean a lot to many.
So you're getting at the point that maybe consciousness is just an emergent property of matter.
Yeah.
But I guess as a Christian, I hear all this, and I find it remarkable that as an atheist you ask that question about what happens when you die. I find that remarkable, and I think
you become flowers. That's what I told my niece.
And this isn't all to say you're being consistent or what have you. As a Christian, and this isn't a proof, this isn't an argument. I'm just saying, as a Christian, I understand that as like the fingerprint of God in your heart, giving you a pointer that there might be something beyond what you're experiencing here. That you know is true even though you can't substantiate it. And I would just say follow that tug and be a seeker and you'll find God. That's what I understand. I understand you don't see it that way, but for me I think this, and you're not unique, I think it's just, it takes effort not to believe in God. There's just so much that pulls us to Him.
I've been given the cue. I'm sorry for all those who are standing in line. We are down to the last question before some closing statements. For those of you who have been standing and waiting, thank you. I believe both of our speakers are willing to entertain and talk to you afterwards.
Long and answer, right?
So these are great questions. Thank you for them, but we'll have to go to the final question now. I believe it's on this mic.
Thank you for getting me just under the wire. Since both of you seem to agree against the topic that science, or whether or not science points to atheism, it seems that both of you answer in the negative to that question. So to oversimplify a very complex topic, the way I understand science works is that we form a hypothesis, and then we try to falsify that hypothesis. And so for me, if the hypothesis is God exists, then I would try to...
Well, no, but it's also, you have to follow specific rules, and one of the key rules is you never propose God as you never deal with supernatural things. It's embedded in science. As soon as you make that hypothesis, you're violating the rules of science.
But if we're asking the question of whether or not science points to atheism...
But science can't even think about the question without violating its own rules. So what you're doing is just outside the realm of science.
That's the question, though, is whether or not science points to atheism. And if that's what we're asking, then at least let me finish this line of questioning. So if the hypothesis is that God exists, then the way that one might attempt to falsify that is to look at, well, what would we expect to see in the world if God did not exist? And what I see in the world is, as we brought up, random suffering. What I see in the world is that a majority of the people in the world don't believe in any particular God that anybody else believes in. Most people are not Christian. Most people are not Muslim. What we would expect to see in the world is that people believe things that we know are not true. Based on what we know of psychology and biology and physics, it seems to me that the overwhelming evidence points against there being an omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent God.
I would just say there's just so many logical flaws in this, what you're saying. Because just because God exists doesn't mean that we can reliably know Him.
But isn't that an argument from ignorance? If you're going to bring up logical fallacies...
I think there's just a lot of assumptions about... you're disproving a particular type of God. But there's no guarantee that God is that God. And I would say that the God that I know is nothing like the God you're describing. So sure, you've disproven a God that I agree doesn't exist. And so, we can go on from there and now talk about the God that I think exists, but that God is actually pretty consistent with a lot of these things.
With random suffering and...
Yeah, it is. He is.
And actually, and one thing you mentioned was that you found to be very compelling was that the prophets were willing to die for their God. Isn't that what the 9/11 terrorists were willing to do? And isn't that a kind of disgusting...
Sure. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that religion is a uniform source of good. By the way, I'm kind of going on.
No. But let's to be fair to everybody. So
we can talk afterwards. I'm happy to.
You can converse later if you like.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
But no, if you had, did you want to finish your thought? I didn't mean to cut you off too.
Yeah. I would just say. I get that there's that God can seem. A lot of the stuff. I get where you're coming from. We want to only believe things that we fully understand. But if God really exists, I guarantee you we do not fully understand Him. And I would point to all the things that he pointed to as strong evidence that we do not fully understand Him. And one way to look at that is that, well, because I don't fully understand Him, I'm just not going to believe it. But I guess I have a different position than myself. I just think there's things that exist in this world that I don't understand. And I'm willing to trust on what I've seen about Jesus, even though I don't fully understand it.
Okay, thank you for your questions. So just as our final segment here, we had the question of 1 to 2 minutes from each of you about what you would have the audience members take away from tonight's discussion. Sort of what would you most like them to take away 1 or 2 minutes, if you can do that.
Sure. Well, the first thing is that this is an important issue, and anybody who has strong beliefs about that issue should think seriously about that issue, and think critically about the reasons why they think they believe what they believe. So we all grew up with ideas about God, whether you were born in a family of believers or non-believers. And at some point in your life, you need to step back and figure out what are the reasons why you believe what you believe. Have a critical look at them and figure out your own way to approach those questions. And that doesn't have to be through dogmatism or relativism. Take the smart way, which is the hard way, which is the way in which you struggle a bit. That's it.
I would say just two things. One is a message to both Christians and those of us that aren't Christian here. It's paraphrasing a quote from one of my favorite scientists, Blaise Pascal. He says that those that come to you with proofs of God that do not involve Jesus Christ have very weak proofs.
That's all the guys in my class, by the way, that we're going to talk about.
And Pascal,
cosmological argument, and ontological argument, and blah blah argument, and blah blah.
I mean, I'm not saying that they're wrong, but they're weak proofs without Jesus. I mean, I think Jesus is the only way. The second thing is that if there's anything that piques your interest, I would just say, pursue it. And the Christian way of saying what Soazig just mentioned is, go seek the truth. Go see where it leads, and you might find really beautiful things in that journey.
Know yourself and dare to know.
Yes, let's give them a round of applause.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.